The night Vivian Holt was publicly humiliated at the Mercer Foundation Gala, she was wearing a dress she'd saved 3 paychecks to buy. It was burgundy, long-sleeved to cover the arms she'd spent years learning not to hate. She'd stood in front of the mirror in her apartment bathroom for 20 minutes before leaving, turning sideways, telling herself it looked fine, it looked good, it looked fine. The saleswoman at the boutique had said it was elegant. Vivian had believed her. She stopped believing her somewhere around the time Connor Ashby stepped up to the microphone at the center of the Mercer Grand Ballroom, looked directly at her across 200 glittering guests, and said, "This one's actually easy. The answer is no." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms do when something irreversible has just happened. Vivian had asked him, quietly, standing near the appetizer table with a glass of sparkling water because she didn't drink at work events, whether he still intended to move forward with their relationship. They'd been together for 8 months. He'd met her parents in November. She had a drawer at his apartment. Had. Past tense. She understood that now. Connor smiled at the microphone like a man who'd just won something. "I've been meaning to do this the professional way," he said, loud enough that even the waitstaff paused. "But Vivian keeps making it difficult, so..." He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless charm. "We're done. We've been done. I just needed her to understand it." There was a beat of silence, and then, worse than the silence, a ripple of polite, uncomfortable laughter from the people who knew Connor and liked him and didn't know Vivian at all. She set her sparkling water down on the nearest table without spilling it. That was what she remembered later. That she didn't spill it. That her hand was perfectly steady, even when the rest of her felt like the floor had dissolved under her heels. She walked toward the exit, not fast, not slow. She was a structural analyst at a civil engineering firm, and she had been trained professionally to assess load-bearing capacity, to look at a structure and determine exactly how much weight it could hold before it came apart. She was doing now. To self, quietly, in a burgundy dress that had cost her 3 paychecks. She made it as far as the coat check hallway before she stopped and pressed her back against the paneled wall and breathed. She did not cry. This was important. She did not cry because the coat check attendant was watching her from behind the counter with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to say something, and Vivian could not handle being witnessed in that particular way. Not tonight. Not yet. What she did not know, could not have known, was that the hallway had another occupant. He was standing at the far end, near the service door, holding a glass of something amber-colored that he hadn't touched. He was wearing a dark suit that cost more than Vivian's monthly rent, and he was watching her with an expression that wasn't pity, wasn't amusement, wasn't the careful social neutrality of someone pretending not to see. He was simply watching. Still, the way certain people are still when they've trained themselves to be, when stillness is a choice, not a default. His name was Adrian Vane. Most people in the room they'd just left knew the name. The ones who moved in financial circles knew it better. Vane Capital, the private equity firm that had quietly acquired a controlling interest in 6 major infrastructure companies in the last 4 years, including, as of last month, Mercer Construction Group, which was why Adrian Vane was at this gala at all. He hadn't wanted to be. He'd told his assistant, Petra, that he would stay 40 minutes and not a single one more. He'd been here for 53. He watched Vivian Holt press her back against the wall, set her jaw, and breathe through what had just been done to her in a room full of people who had mostly looked away. He watched her not cry. He watched the coat check attendant glance at her and glance away. He watched her gather herself, actually watched the moment it happened, the slight shift in her shoulders, the decision being made somewhere behind her eyes. He thought, she's going to be all right. And then, because something about the certainty of it surprised him, he thought it again. She became aware of him approximately 40 seconds later. He saw the moment she registered his presence, the small recalibration, the quick assessment, the same steadiness she'd had walking out of that ballroom. "If you're going to say something sympathetic," she said, Please don't. I wasn't. She looked at him properly then. You watched that. I was already in the hallway. That's not what I asked. He considered her. She was direct in a way that most people weren't in social situations, direct without aggression, the way people are when they've spent enough time being underestimated that they've stopped pretending. Yes, he said. I watched it. And nothing. It was a cowardly thing to do. The man has no class. He said it the way someone might note a structural deficiency, matter of fact, without drama. Your dress is fine, by the way. In case you were wondering. Vivian stared at him for a moment. I wasn't. All right. She straightened away from the wall. She was preparing to leave. He could see that. Had decided that the conversation was over, that she wanted to be gone, that the exit was 12 feet away, and she was going to walk through it with her head up and her hand steady, and she was going to get in a cab and go home, and she was not. Absolutely not. Going to give Connor Ashby or anyone else in this building anything more than she'd already had taken from her tonight. Your name, he said. Not a question. Something between a powerful men sometimes speakment when they're more curious than they intend to be. She paused. Vivian Holt, Adrian Vane, a beat. She knew the name. He watched her recognize it, watched the flicker of recalibration, not starstruck, just recalibrating, the way a good analyst does when new data arrives. Yes. I work in structural analysis. My firm consulted on 2 of the Mercer Bridge projects last year. He looked at her differently then. Which ones? The Caldwell Overpass and the Route 9 interchange. I wrote the load reports. He was quiet for a moment. The Caldwell report flagged a tension issue in the east pylon that the original contractor missed. It did. That report cost Mercer $4 million and saved them 40. Vivian said nothing because she knew that, and she hadn't needed to be told. Adrian Vane set his untouched glass down on the coat check counter. I have a meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m., he said. If you're interested in being the one who explains that report to me in person, rather than through 6 layers of contractors who don't understand it. She looked at him steadily. That's an unusual way to schedule a meeting. I've heard that. I have a job. I'm aware. Why would you want me specifically? Because you walked out of that room without letting him see it matter. Adrian said, and because the Caldwell report is the best structural analysis document I've read in 3 years, and because I think you already know both of those things are related. The silence stretched. 8 a.m., Vivian said finally. Vane Capital, 22nd floor. She picked up her coat from the counter. She walked to the exit. She did not look back. He watched her go. And then, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Adrian Vane finished his drink. She almost didn't go. She lay in bed that night in her apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a temperamental elevator and a radiator that made sounds like it was personally aggrieved. And she stared at the ceiling and told herself, very reasonably, that the meeting was nothing, that Adrian Vane was a man who'd witnessed her humiliation and felt some version of pity about it, and expressed it in the way men like him expressed things, through professional gestures that cost them nothing and made them feel better about walking past someone else's hard moment. She told herself that at midnight, she was less convinced by 2 a.m., because here was the thing about Vivian Holt that the people in Connor Ashby's circle had never quite understood, had never tried to understand, had looked at her in her 3-paycheck dress and her carefully controlled expressions, and never bothered to see past. She was extraordinary at her job, not competent, not reliable, extraordinary, the kind of extraordinary that is quiet, that doesn't announce itself, that sits in a well-organized spreadsheet, and in a flagged pylon report that catches a $4 million error that 17 people before her had missed. She knew what she was worth. She'd known it since she was 12 years old and had taught herself calculus from library books because her school didn't offer it. She'd known it at 22 when she'd graduated top of her class from a state school with an engineering degree while working 25 hours a week at a copy shop. She'd known it in the 8 months she'd spent with Connor Ashby, who'd thought he was doing her a favor. She showed up at the Vane Capital offices at 7:58 a.m. The 22nd floor smelled like cedar and expensive paper. The receptionist had her name already, Adrian Vane's assistant, a composed woman named Petra, who moved like she was always slightly ahead of the conversation, walked her to a corner office where the city spread out below two walls of glass like an apology for all the times it had looked away. Adrian Vane was already there. He was standing at the window with a coffee cup and a tablet, and he turned when she walked in without any of the performative surprise that people sometimes use to suggest they hadn't been waiting. "Vivian," he said. "Mr. Vane, Adrian." He set the tablet down. "Sit down. Tell me what the Caldwell East pylon would have done in a Category 3 load event if your flag had been missed." And that was how the meeting started. It lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. She'd brought her original notes. He'd read the full report. They went back and forth across the technical details, the way two people argue when they're both right about different things, and they know it, and they don't have time to be polite about it. He asked questions she hadn't expected him to know to ask. She pushed back on two of his assumptions about projected traffic load. He revised his position without making a production of it. At 10:43, he said, "I want to offer you a consulting position, independent contract. You'd consult on all Mercer infrastructure acquisitions going forward, analysis, flagging, final review authority before any capital commitment." Vivian was quiet for a moment. That's a significant scope of authority for an independent contractor. "Yes, you don't know me. I know the Caldwell report, and I know you showed up this morning." She looked out the window at the city. "My current firm has a non-compete. I've read it." "It doesn't apply to independent consulting in this capacity." She turned back to him. "You read my non-compete agreement. I read everything relevant before a meeting." She thought about Connor Ashby at the microphone. She thought about 200 people looking away. She thought about 3 paychecks and a burgundy dress and a floor that had dissolved under her heels, and the fact that her hand had been perfectly steady. "I need the terms in writing by end of week," she said. "You'll have them by tomorrow morning." She stood. She picked up her folder. She was at the door when he said her name once. "Vivian," and she stopped. "He was wrong about you," Adrian said. "Not gently, not like a comfort, like a fact. In case you needed to hear it from someone who has no reason to lie about it." She stood there for 1 second. "2, I didn't need to hear it," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I said it." She left. She did not expect the contract to change anything about her life beyond the professional. She was wrong about that. The terms were precise, generous, and slightly unusual in ways that only became clear later. A clause about access to Vane Capital internal data, a provision for direct line communication with Adrian himself, an equity stake in 3 of the Mercer subsidiaries that she'd almost missed in the legal language, and would have if she hadn't read it twice. She called the number listed for questions and got Petra, who confirmed that yes, all of that was intentional. Was there anything else? The work itself was absorbing in the way that good work is, the kind that fills up the hours without effort, that makes you look up and realize it's dark outside and you've forgotten to be unhappy. She was reviewing project files, flagging risk, writing reports that went directly to Adrian's desk, and came back with notes in the margins that were terse and specific and, occasionally, wrong in ways she corrected without ceremony. He never pushed back on her corrections. She found this unreasonably interesting. They had meetings, weekly at first, then more often. Drawn by the pace of the acquisitions, they were always professional. He was not warm, exactly. Warmth wasn't the right word for Adrian Vane. He was precise. He was consistent. He had the specific quality of men who have decided what they value and don't spend energy pretending otherwise. He always had her coffee ready before she arrived. She did not mention this because she did not know what it meant, and she had learned a long time ago not to assign meaning to things before she understood them. She understood Connor Ashby 4 weeks after the gala when he called her. She was at her kitchen table with a site report spread across it when her phone lit up with his name. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about the ballroom, the microphone, 200 people looking away. She let it go to voicemail. He called again the next day, and the day after that, the voicemails escalated in a predictable pattern. First, casual. "Hey, just checking in." Then, explino, that was a lot. Then something closer to panic that he was trying to disguise as rationality. "I've been hearing your name mentioned in some conversations, and I think we should talk." She understood then what she hadn't understood at the gala. Connor Ashby hadn't humiliated her because he'd stopped caring about her. He'd humiliated her because he'd never started. She had been, to him, something to manage. A presence he'd tolerated and then discarded publicly. And he'd done it publicly because he'd believed, with the casual confidence of a man who has never had to think very hard about this, that no one important was watching. He'd been wrong. She called him back on a Thursday morning, sitting in her car outside the Vane Capital parking structure. "Vivian," he said. The relief in his voice was embarrassing. "I know what you've been doing," she said. "I'm calling to tell you not to call me again." Can we talk about this?" "I don't think so." "Vivian, I'm hearing your name in places I wouldn't have expected." "Connor." She let the silence land. "I've been doing excellent work for a long time. The only thing that's changed is who's paying attention to it. That's a you problem." She ended the call. Then she got out and went upstairs to work. The first time Adrian looked at her differently, that she noticed, that she was willing to count, was a Tuesday in March, 8 months after the gala, during a review meeting for the Harwick Industrial Portfolio. They'd been in the conference room for 3 hours. The acquisition team was exhausted. Vivian had just finished walking through a flagged issue with the Harwick plant's foundation load calculations, a deficiency that, if unaddressed, would destabilize the East Annex within 7 years, and she'd been talking to the room, pointing at the projection, and when she turned to check the table's response, Adrian was watching her the way she'd noticed him watching her once before. Not the room, her. She finished the point. She sat down. She did not make anything of it. After the meeting, he stopped her in the hallway. He said, "Do you have capacity to lead the remediation planning? That's a significant project addition." "I'm aware." She looked at him. "Adrian," she said carefully, "what's happening here?" He was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness again, the chosen stillness. He said, "I think you already know. I'd like to hear you say it." And he did something she hadn't seen him do before, in 8 months of weekly meetings and margin notes and corrected assumptions. He looked, for exactly 1 second, uncertain. "I've been thinking about this since the coat check hallway," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty, and I found it more complicated than I expected." Vivian said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing when it was necessary. "I wasn't watching you that night because I felt sorry for you," he said. "I was watching you because you were the most interesting person in the room before Ashby opened his mouth, and after you were the most interesting person I'd seen in years." She let that sit. "I have a conflict of interest," she said finally. "The consulting contract. Yes, I know. That's a problem." "It's a solvable problem," he said. "If you want it to be." She looked at the wall past his shoulder. She thought about 8 months of margin notes. She thought about a coffee that was always ready. She thought about "I know. That's why I said it." "I'm not easy," she said. "I push back, I correct you when you're wrong. I'm not going to stop doing that." "I know," he said. "That's partly the point. I don't want to be managed, Vivian." Something shifted in his voice. Not softer, exactly. Quieter. "I have never once in 8 months tried to manage you." She thought about that. It was true. It was demonstrably, provably true, and she was a woman who lived by demonstrable and provable. "I need to think," she said. "Take the time you need." She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stood there and thought, very clearly, about what it meant that her hand was perfectly steady. She pressed the button for floor 22 again. The elevator doors opened. She stepped back out. The Harwick remediation. she said. I'll lead it. He looked at her. And dinner, she said. Friday. But we do this right. No company involvement until there's something worth structuring around. We figure out what this is first. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. She went back to the elevator. This time, she let it take her down. What happened to Connor Ashby did not happen because of Adrian Vane. This was important, and Vivian understood it clearly, which was why she didn't think about Connor Ashby very much at all. What happened was this: the Mercer audit. The one that Vivian's reports had necessitated. The one that had triggered a formal review of all contractor relationships going back 5 years, turned up a pattern of bid manipulation involving a construction management firm called Ashby Crest Partners, which was Connor Ashby's firm, which he'd founded the year before he'd met Vivian, and which she had never, in 8 months of proximity, known anything about because he'd never considered her worth telling. The Federal Contracting Board opened an investigation in April. By June, 3 Ashby Crest projects had been pulled from active status. By August, Connor's business partner had agreed to cooperate with the government's case. Vivian found out through an industry newsletter. She read the article at her desk with her morning coffee, and a feeling that was not satisfaction, or not only satisfaction, but something closer to the specific clarity that arrives when a structure you've been assessing finally reveals the failure point you knew was there. She mentioned it to Adrian that evening. They were at the kitchen table in his apartment, hers more often than not now these evenings, and he was going through site reports while she worked on the Harwick remediation timeline. He looked up when she said Connor's name. "I know," he said. "How long have you known?" "I suspected patterns in the Mercer contractor data about 6 weeks ago. The attorneys flagged it formally last month." She looked at him. "You didn't tell me. It wasn't my information to share, and you weren't involved. I could have been. I consulted on projects he had bids on." "I know." He held her gaze. "You were clean, Vivian. Every flag you wrote stood on its own. I needed you to know that the work was yours, and I needed it not to look like I was managing the situation around you." She was quiet. "You could have told me," she said again, "not an accusation. A statement about the future." "Yes," he said, "you're right. I should have." She looked back at her timeline. She moved a line item. She said, "Thank you for checking." He said, "Always." There was a dinner later, a Vane Capital investor event, the first one she attended, not as an independent consultant, but as something the room recognized, something that registered differently in the calculations people make when they're deciding who matters and who doesn't. She wore a dress that was deep emerald, a color she'd avoided for years for reasons she'd stopped giving herself, and she walked in next to Adrian with the specific posture of someone who has decided, once and for all, that the floor will hold. She saw people adjust. She saw the micro-recalibrations, the whispered questions, the looks that moved from her to Adrian and back to her and tried to add something up that didn't compute the way they'd expected. A woman approached her early in the evening. Tall, blonde, the particular sleekness of someone who has spent a lot of time in rooms like this one. Her name was Cassandra Weil, and she was the kind of woman who asked questions that were really statements. "You're the structural analyst," she said. "Adrian's been talking about the Harwick project. I lead it, yes, he's been talking about you." She said it with the tone of someone opening a door to see was on the other side. Vivian looked at her pleasantly. "I'm aware. You're not what I would have expected," Cassandra said. "What did you expect?" A pause, a recalibration. "Someone different." "Most people do," Vivian said, "and then they adjust." She moved on. She found Adrian across the room, in conversation with 2 board members. He caught her eye when she was still 20 feet away, and something happened in his face. Not a performance, not a social cue, but the quiet, deliberate thing that happened in his face when he was in the coat check hallway, and she'd pressed her back against the wall and breathed. He excused himself from the conversation. "How are you doing?" he asked when he reached her. She looked around the room. 200 people, more or less. Silk and crystal, and the low current of social calculation. a room that looked exactly like another room in a different hotel 8 months ago. "I'm all right," she said. He handed her a glass of sparkling water, because he knew she didn't drink at work events, because he had known that for 8 months, because he had been paying attention in ways that Connor Ashby had never thought to. "More than all right," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Stop, I mean it. I know you do." She took the glass. She looked back at the room. "That's the part I'm getting used to." He stood beside her, not in front, not behind, but beside. And they looked out at the room together, and the room looked back and adjusted, and Vivian Holt, who had saved 3 paychecks for a dress she'd worn to be humiliated in, who had walked out of that ballroom with a steady hand and never once asked to be rescued, held her sparkling water, felt very clearly like exactly where she was supposed to be. She had not gotten here because someone had chosen her. She had gotten here because she had never stopped being worth choosing, and she had finally stopped being in rooms where the people couldn't tell the difference.